In the land of the spider gods, a girl counted the stars and waited. The hillside where she crouched was exposed to the eyes of the enemy, with just a few mossy and pungent boulders for cover. But the men never seemed to look up from under their hoods, bent in prayer around the fountain below. They lit flambeaux and put them out again in an order only they understood. 7 of the brothers wore black robes. The 8th wore red and carried a spear. In the land of her mother's grave and her father's memory, a girl counted the stars and waited. My name is Imam Baksh. I'm from Guyana in South America. I write novels, mostly for young adults, featuring a lot of adventure and magic. I think even though we've had writers for many generations, our literature is relatively unknown, so it presents a certain freshness to the international stage. And we have something there that I can help bring to the world that they've probably never seen before, the elements of our specific culture, especially our language. The worst thing is we are not a very literary society. Just a few generations ago, most of us were working in the colonial plantations. So we haven't had time to develop that sense of connection to books. My grandfather didn't learn to read until he was 50, for instance. But more and more young people today are people who enjoy books, popular books, culture, and classics. But for me, there is a specific disconnect. I tend to write a lot about the issues facing underprivileged young men. But underprivileged young men are very unlikely to pick up my books. Despite our harsh colonial past, we have a mix of cultures that were brought there through that history. European, the indigenous people, West Africa, India. And together, the influences from around the world have fused into something that is really unusual, unique, vibrant, and I enjoy living in that culture because it is so wide and deep. I think for me as a writer, the most important thing was my parents. They were the ones who read to me as a child and then taught me to read and then made books available to me. Even if they were unable to purchase books for me, they would make sure I had books that I could borrow from their friends or their friends' friends. And so I developed a love for learning. We had a room in our house that we called the library, which was shelves of books. And this was very unusual for a Guyanese child. And I don't think it's any surprise that I ended up becoming a writer, given that history. I think there's a part when you start getting into the construction of the story where you start making connections. You have certain ideas of things that we would like to put into the work. And then you start to realize, I could connect them this way. Or you read an article or something in the news, or you watch a video about the history of, say, Sumeria. And you realize, these two ideas work through this common history that they might have. And I can connect things together, or I could connect 2 characters, or I could say, oh, this character is actually this other character's sister, and they never realized it. It's not always something so melodramatic, but I enjoyed that part of the process a lot. Everything's coming together. The part I don't like is the part where you start having to kick ideas out the door or throw them out the window. You can only fit so much in a book. And at some point you're like, oh, it'll be great for this, it'll be great for some of that, we're throwing a little bit of this, oh, and it works for, no, you can't put 4 things in here. This is only 1 chapter. You have to start cutting down. And some things get thrown out and never, ever come back. Ideas aren't free, you work for them. I don't think there's any particular duty for writers. I do think all citizens have duties to participate in their society responsibly and constructively. And I think if a writer is being a good citizen, it will come out in their work, in what they say and how they say it. And I think more people need to stop feeling like it's only the public intellectuals who should speak. I would like to see more people in the common parts of society say to themselves, I am a citizen, I have duties, and maybe sometimes realize, as with COVID, that being a good citizen might involve just shutting up and not spreading misinformation and fear. Generally, I don't like the idea of the state involved in literature. Guyana's greatest poet, Martin Carter, he has a quote I like to bring up, which is that a mouth is always muzzled by the hand that feeds it. And of course, that can apply to all forms of funding, whether it's private individuals, corporations, even crowdfunding. But with a government, they have the power to pass laws, enact policies. They have the army, the police, the use of force. So you have to be extra careful with giving them a voice through your art or your literature. I think maybe I feel this way because I grew up in a dictatorship. And I remember when I was a child that I could see a reality around me that was not what the government narrative said. And to this day, when I think of how I grew up and if that feeling of being in two versions of reality, it's one of the things that can still get me into a high state of internal rage. But I don't think it's just a danger for autocratic regimes. I think in a liberal democracy, the danger exists. It's just a matter of degree. I think any government has an agenda, whether it's maintaining the status quo or perpetuating the power and privilege of that government. It will try to erase dissent. And one way you can erase dissent, or you don't even have to suppress dissent if there is no dissent, and if you buy off the writers, they're unlikely to write against you. So, for instance, the US military will not cooperate with any film that portrays the US military in a bad light, which means that a film producer is encouraged to make a film that is not critical of the US military and US policy. So that kind of potential for misuse makes me very wary of government funding of literature, or at least of a large amount of it. But I do think there is a role for the government in some aspects of literature. For instance, the preservation of literature, cultural exchanges. So if there is a community that has suffered suppression, or there's a language community that is endangered, their literature is endangered, or an oral tradition, that literature might be in danger, I could see the government rightfully saying, we will try to preserve these things for our country's heritage. And similarly, cultural exchange. The last public event we had with the IWP, we had a quote from Eudora Welty where she talked about one of the best ways for people in different nations to understand each other is to see each other's stories. So I think the government in programs like IWP has a good role in promoting diplomacy and friendship across nations through literature. Right, so there is a work out of Jamaica called The Young Warriors by V.S. Reed. It is a book set in the colonial occupation, and the main characters are escaped enslaved people who live in the mountains. They're called the Maroons, and they are resistance fighters against the British occupation. And it is the first novel I think I read as a child that included all the elements that I still like in my literature. And it has shaped me as a writer, I suppose, because it was the model in many ways. First of all, it is entertaining, it has action, it has set pieces, it has scope in the setting. The adventure is there, but also you feel connected to the characters. Like, this is a story of 5 young teenagers, and I remember feeling like I was the 6th in that story because of how well that connection was made. And it is also a moral tale. The 5th boy is morally dubious. He's a cheat, he's dishonest, he's boastful, and as you go through the story, he learns from these mistakes, and ultimately, near the end of the book, he has an opportunity to be brave, make moral choices that are for the good of his people and for himself. And that arc and the culmination alongside an entertaining adventure, that's the kind of story I really enjoy. So I get asked a lot about social issues in my book and other things along those lines, and I very rarely get asked about how I make my stories entertaining. And to me, one of the chief roles of a writer or author is to make the story move and for the author to connect the reader into that story. And there are techniques I use that I am very proud of, and the effort I make to put that in there. Well, I think, let's start with what I will not use. Narratives that describe a person or a character in terms of generalities. I would not say, for example, Walter was a brave boy or Walter was a smart boy. You would want to show Walter being brave or Walter being smart. And you would also want to show that in the context of a sympathetic light. Or if Walter is an evil character, you can show Walter being smart and evil at the same time. In fact, some of the most fun things to write are the villainous scenes. I draw on my own personality for my villainy, I have to confess. I don't know how it's got there, but there is a part of me that would like to be the Lord of the world and rule by decree. And I have that part of me. I can't use it in real life, but I can throw it into my books. And I think some of the juiciest things I've ever written are the villains not monologuing, but trying to convince the protagonist that they are right. And there is a back and forth I use. And I think one of the strategies I use, we're getting off entertainment and we're actually ending up talking about messaging, but I like to put things I think are true in the mouths of the villain because it can be stunning to, I think, the reader to find themselves agreeing with the villain in some of what he's saying. And then that holds them into a connection with the villain. And then they're interested in this character. They want to find out, where did he go wrong? Or maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I should pay attention and he's actually right. They're not, but the villain is the villain. That's one of the things I do believe, that ultimately you should see the villain as a villain by the end of the book. One of the things I spend a lot of time on is betrayals. Every novel I've written has a big betrayal, and it is carefully set up from the beginning. The reader must have a reason to like the traitor before the betrayal happens. The main character must have a reason to trust the traitor before the betrayal happens. And when you see the betrayal happen, the reader must be able to think, oh wait, those things that happened earlier, that's what it really was. So that third element must be there as well, where they can see that all along he really was that traitor, or she. Oh, I don't know if necessarily I think it's a fault line between young adult and fiction in general. It's just that, and I don't ever think of myself in the moment that I'm writing as a young adult writer. I just think of myself as presenting a tale. There's stuff that happens afterwards that I'll edit and clean up because I think, okay, the audience will be young adult. But generally speaking, what makes young adult for me is that you're dealing with issues and a character who is a young adult, and the issues that they face. Well, when I say the villain is a villain, it's not that I'm trying to specifically do anything that has to do with young adult. It's just the stories I like to tell ultimately is going to be good versus evil. I think that's my preference. It's not any particular philosophical statement. I just like that the tale turns out that way. When I say that I want the villain to be a villain at the end, I think one of the reasons is that, remember I mentioned in V.S. Reed's book that the boy has to make a moral choice.
Yeah.
If the villain is a villain, then my characters have to make a moral choice too. And I think that might be part of why I like the story to come down to that.